Oh, Father, we thank you and we praise you for this day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the blessings of technology. We ask that you bless this study, bless this time together. Kam Yeshua HaMashiach, I pray. Amen. Short and sweet. All right, so we are, welcome, Dan. We are in Acts. We're going to be finishing up 26 and starting into 27. A little bit more narrative here and a little bit less Greek than last time, but still a bit as usual. But just kind of to remind everybody where we were. So the last time we looked at Acts, we were dealing with Paul's testimony before Agrippa and Festus. And because we touched on those events, that particular description so many times in the past, I'd gone a little bit deeper into it, looking at the metaphysical and figurative language that depths within the language. And so I spent half our time on one verse, which I sent out to everybody. I hope everyone got that. So, kind of just exploring the pivotal language, the alternative spiritual context that can be found in the depth of the Greek, the meaning in the Greek. And the last time when we wrapped up, I talked a little bit about Paul's reference to exercise and work of repentance, right? This idea that it was a daily methodical recognition of shortcomings and seeking God, as well as confession of sin. And so where we're picking up here now is we're sort of sliding out of the end of Paul's testimony into the response of the audience, and then we're going to get into the beginning of his voyage to Rome. So if I can get this to progress, there we go. Would someone like to read for us these verses here?
To this day, I have had to help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim life both to our people and to the Gentiles. And as he was saying these things in the trance, Festus said with a loud voice, "Paul, are you out of your mind? Your great learning is driving you out of your mind." But Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking truth and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to go I speak boldly, and I am persuaded that none of these things have escaped this notice, and this is not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." And Agrippa said to Paul, "In a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul said, "Whether short or long, I would go to God, that only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." Then the king rose and the government of Bernice and those who sit there with them, and when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." But Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed."
Yeah. Interesting to think about in this passage here. Definitely some interesting tidbits we can glean. So, coming back to verse 22, Paul, he's making his case, his proof, if you will, that God is on his side, right? He declares, and the phrase here is epikurios un tychon, and epikurios meaning aid succor, help, and defense, and taikon referring to an event that takes place, and goes on to say that it is from God, right? So simply put, help happened from God, and not just in one instance, but ongoing, as Paul puts it, even unto this day, right? While he witnesses to the micro and the megalo, the micro being the small, the little ones, and or in greater depth, those of inferior rank. One might even say the poorest of the poor, right? And the megalo being the opposite, right? That's the great and the mighty, those of esteem and power, such as Agrippa. So Paul is arguing here that everything he says about what is to become has already been said by the prophets and Moses. And interestingly, the Greek adds Moses on almost as an afterthought. It makes me wonder if Luke added it to what Paul said it is. It just kind of feels like an extra thing here. So you can see it here too in the Greek. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but at the very end, it's at the very, very end of the passage that we have the word Moses there. So it's kind of like this extra thing. He makes this statement about the prophets and Moses. So just thought that was interesting. And, his statements, I find Paul's statements here fascinating and bold, right? He's declaring that not only is God on his side, but to condemn him is to condemn both the prophets and Moses. So he's implying that that basically these people who have condemned him have condemned the prophets and Moses as well, which is it's a very controversial statement. But moving on, Paul, he doesn't leave them guessing about what the prophet said, right? However, the anointed one must pathetos, and that word means to be subject to suffering or have a capacity for suffering, and then be the first to rise from the dead. And in Greek, we have a word that the various English translations have all approached differently here, or a phrase. And we discussed the word phos last time, and that was phos is the word light, can be truth, it can be revelation. And so you have this phrase, phos mele katangalion. And roughly it is the light or the truth is about to be proclaimed. I find that interesting, right? And there's this sense of being on the verge, right? Because that word Malay really implies something that hasn't happened yet, but will happen. So it's not just his statements being the proclamation of light, but this is something that's about to happen. And I thought there's a couple of different ways we could interpret this phrase, right? First is that the Messiah, right, the first fruits of the resurrection, is about to proclaim the truth to all peoples, right? Because he uses that reference to our people and the nations. So it could be the return. He could be referencing the return and judgment in this statement, right? So the promised prophecy of the millennial reign, when every knee will bow and tongue confess. Or it could simply be a reference to the truth that Yeshua gave his followers after his resurrection, subsequently being taught, right? So there's a couple different ways to look at that. Or I suppose the last one could simply be that Paul is referring to the truth he is and has been proclaiming before Agrippa in the court, the truth about who Yeshua is, what that means. But I think he's more likely referencing the first scenario, right? He because of this sense of something to come. Because we know that the early church, they all believed that Yeshua would return before their deaths. Most of them did anyway. And you get that sense when you read the epistles, right? There was always that sense of just on the edge.
Daniel.
Yeah, go ahead.
That has been a theme since the beginning. Even in Adam and Eve's time, as we call them Adam and Eve, actually it's Adam and Hava, they all believed that the next thing would happen would be the restoration.
Right.
And that's why Cain was named the way he was to start with. They all believed that. And then once the Messiah came, I think it became even more pointed and more acceptable, but more disillusioning for the people, because so many of the people lost faith because nothing happened.
Right. Yeah. And that's why, before you guys joined us, Joan and I were talking about how the events, like the events in Afghanistan, are things that had to happen, right? These are things that had to happen, but at the same time, we don't really know when that end is coming. And that's made also very clear in scripture, which is, it's kind of funny, the contradiction. They're constantly expecting it to happen, but they're also living in this realization that, you know, Yeshua made it very clear, no one's going to know exactly when it'll come. And that's intentional, because otherwise we'd be living in a fatalistic sort of mindset of, well, you know,
It doesn't really matter.
it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter how I act or anything else, right? And that's a danger when we get in too deep into predestination and the foreknew and all that stuff. So, so I mean, the third, in looking at it from the third possible perspective, though, I just to tie it back together is, you know, maybe Paul was about to say something more. We don't know for sure, but then he gets interrupted, right? Festus jumps up and says, well, or I suppose the verse doesn't say that he jumped up, but he says with a loud voice, he yells this out, Paul, you were out of your mind. So, and he calls, so there's actually, in the course of this, there's 3 different words that mean the similar thing of the madness, if you will. The first one here, he says, is mani. And that's, so the root word here is menos, which that's in the Greek, which I pulled that from the LSJ. So that's not Strong's. And that is to be a raving, frantic, like a mad woman. And Strong's is just to be mad or to rave. So that's the first word. And then we have, you know, he refers to the learning, the grammata, that's the things which have been written. We've hit that word before. You know, and he's suggesting that this has caused his madness, but then he uses the word manian, which means a frenzy. So it's a little bit different. You can see here he's suggesting that, you know, he's like a raving lunatic, and that his learning has driven him into a frenzy or of madness, basically. And I thought that was interesting, because remember I had said before with Festus that I believed he was an atheist. And I think this is kind of a hallmark of that particular mindset, that he thinks that, you know, this is all superstitious mumbo jumbo. You know, he's the type that believes that religion is an opiate to the masses. It's something that's not real. You know, and it's a reason that, and it's reasons like this that the Roman Church incorporated various religious practices into the Christian dogma in the early days, right? Because the people who are already suspicious are more likely to embrace new religious ideas if it fits within their social norms, right? Where on the other hand, someone like Festus is a very different mindset. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing we have in that time that most scholars in that forget, remember the Greeks, wherever they came, they established schools. And from kindergarten on, it seems Jan is having trouble staying connected, not positive why. But wherever they were at, they had schools. And so people grew up not believing in resurrection or life or eternal or even God. The Greeks taught against all that.
Right. Certainly a different mindset. And so then we have the third word that I referenced here for madness. So when Paul states his response, when he says, I am not mad, he's saying, I am not menomai. Now, in this case, I found this word in the Greek dictionary versus Strong's, because Strong's reference back to, I think, the previous word here, but menomai actually refers to something, madness that's accompanied with anger. So it's a little bit more, you need a little bit more depth here, right? It's the idea of you've been driven mad by something. So he's saying, I have not been driven mad by something. I'm not in a place of rage and anger. This is not where I'm coming from when he states it that way. And then I thought it was interesting because he replies to address Festus with a title, and that title is kratiste. And it's different than Agrippa. Agrippa he called basileou, which we talked a bit about being, you know, reference to being to kingship. But this word kratiste refers to someone being mighty, strong, noble, illustrious, most excellent. So it's kind of a very much a flattering statement. and I think it's his way of saying, an honorific to say, I'm not crazy here. And then he declares his words to be aletheos, and that is absolute truth, is essentially what that means. Because it's not just simple truth, it's what is reality, fact, certainty. And that's so, to me, that would be our absolute truth. So this is a word I've never seen referenced before, the aletheos, but I was very surprised at the meaning of it, because you would think that that's something that you would, Greek, since some Greek is incorporated into the teachings that are taught in the church, you'd think this word would have come up. At least I would think I would have encountered it before. And then the last thing he says is when he's talking about being rational. Go ahead, Doug.
I can unmute.
I'm terrible. I'm a long distance chatting on the road in upper Montana. But let me tell you this. It ties in with the idea of building your house on a stone foundation versus sand,
Right.
sinking sand. Truth today is whatever the person in power says is true. But reality is, which he's trying to put across, is factual truth, is this is bedrock. You can't get away from it.
Right. And to argue the point that he's not out of his mind, he makes the statement of, kai sophrosynes, or and he has soundness of mind, self-control, no irrationality here, right? He's making it clear he's not mad. His words are absolute truth from a soundness of mind being uttered forth here. And while Paul is addressing Festus, then he turns back to Agrippa, right? And he says to him, and this is, you see the word basileou up here again, that wonderful Greek word I'd talked about before, towards the beginning of the phrase. So he's coming back to this addressing towards Agrippa, and he says to him, paristia zemenos, free spoken, boldly, confident, with confidence. He's speaking, saying, that he feels free to speak these words to Agrippa specifically. And then he plays upon that, upon his ego, and he declares that the message is declared. It's not lanthanian. And you'll notice I don't have, or the word, the translation in our English here has escaped his notice, but it's really, lanthanian is something that's hidden or secret. So you combine that with the previous, the lalo. So he's saying, this is not secret to you, basically. And so it's something that is, and then we have this word here at the end of it. He talks about it's not been done in a corner, but what is that? What does he mean by that? And the word is gonia. Strong's just says it's a corner, but the Greek dictionary refers to gonia as being a secluded spot. So that's the sense being, is that it's not hidden, it's not secret, and it's not been done somewhere where no one would be aware of it. Is, I guess, the gist of what we're getting here. And I think we get that from the English too. It's just kind of, I like to dig just a little deeper if I can. And so, and then he goes on to Agrippa and he says to him, do you believe the prophets, right? Bluntly. And what I think is interesting is he responds, and he doesn't give Agrippa a chance to respond. And he says to him, Oida, I know that you believe, right? And that word can also mean to perceive. And I got to thinking about it as I was reading this, and I thought, he's looking at Agrippa and he sees in his eyes, in his face, in his body language, that as soon as he asks the question, Agrippa instantly is physically responding to him with the, well, of course I believe in the prophets, right? That whole thing of to call himself a Jew, as has been implied here, Agrippa has to acknowledge the prophets, right? He can't call himself a Jew and not acknowledge the prophets, basically. And so I thought that was just an interesting little thing here. My thought was, it could have been something as simple as the slight opening of the eyes, the softening of expression, the relaxing of the body, right? Signs of understanding. However, right, Agrippa, he deflects as someone who doesn't want to make a decision will. He's not, he's got a big audience. He's made a big show of this. For him to acknowledge Paul would have been, I think, perhaps he was afraid of the consequences of that. And he states he states, en oligo me Theus Christiano genestai. Within a little, a few, a time being the implication, persuade a Christian to become or make. Genestai. Genestai, that word that is to be born, to receive, to come into existence. So he clearly understands what Paul is doing. And he's appealing, right? He's appealing directly to Agrippa's heart, not as a plea for release, right? But as a plea for his soul. What's more remarkable in Paul, that he's, rather than pleading for his freedom, that he is like reaching out to save the soul of the torturer. It's a very different message. It's God's message, right? God's message is that we don't care. We're not concerned about as much about ourselves, but about the souls of those around us, about seeing everyone saved, because we know where we are going. We know that we are saved. Therefore, what value do we gain in trying to save ourselves, because we're already saved? And that's, you get that message from Paul and his reaction, his behavior, because anyone else in this position would have been trying to make a case for why they should be released. And so coming, yeah, go ahead, Deb.
I'm sorry.
You don't need to apologize. That's part of this whole thing, is please contribute.
In Jan's having trouble connecting. I can see that. What we deal with, remember, I'm talking about Abraham. Abraham continuously was scared, afraid. Okay.
Yeah.
We have a different character here. Paul knows. Okay. He knows. Therefore, his focus is on you and me and not on himself, where Abraham's focus up until the end of his life was on Abraham.
Right.
I would also state that Paul has already 3 or 4 or 5 times stated the reasons why he should have been let go, and that he was innocent of these charges that were trumped up against him. So why beat a dead horse?
True enough.
He's already made the statements, I am innocent of these charges. You don't have anything to hold me on. So, I mean, even in those, yes, he also did witness to people and share about Yeshua and the belief and everything. But it's just to say that he's already made his case.
It's true enough. And, but I also, though, I do love Paul's response to Agrippa, which is euxaimin, and that means to wish or to pray to God, right? In our translation, we have, I would to God that but not only you, but also all who hear me. But it's more than that. It's more of it's kind of a wishing, but praying as well. He wants not just Agrippa, but everybody present to be like him, such as I, right? Without the bonds or chains. And, one of the things that's interesting to think about is, these people around him, they're not his friends, right? They could even be considered his enemies, because they've all been aware of how he's been unfairly imprisoned for 2 years. And this is the court. So these people would have interacted with him, seen him, heard him, and yet he still wants to have them, see them all saved. That's not human nature. Human nature is to punish those who harm us. So knowing the power that God worked through Paul, personally, I want to believe that many who were listening were in fact moved by Paul. How, we don't have any record of that, but, knowing what we have seen in what has been recorded by Luke, there is that the very real possibility that many people did come to know, but we don't have any record of it because they would not have been able to be witness to that transformation. And I do think, moving on. It is interesting. Luke records that all those seated in the front, right, Agrippa, Festus, Bernice, and probably others, likely advisors, they rose together, which kind of precludes, as a prelude to issuing a judgment. And then he records that they anachorisantes, and that word in Greek, it means to retreat or retire. So, I thought it was, and I thought it was kind of a little bit ironic too, that the Greek would associate retiring with retreating. Just thought that was interesting because, it does sort of suggest the idea that to retire from something is to retreat from it rather than simply stepping away, if you will, which is, because you get this sense that they want to have maybe a private conversation. However, Luke and or Paul were able to overhear what was being said, and they all agree, right? Nothing worthy of punishment, and they specifically refer to this idea of death or chains, right? There's that admission that Felix had done wrong to Paul, and then Festus had done wrong to maintain the imprisonment. But in the end, we appear that Agrippa is the most persuaded because he's the one who states this phrase, apollos thai, meaning to loose, let go, set free, dismiss, send away, etc., right, regarding Paul. But their hands are tied. The appeal has been made to Caesar, and so therefore there's nothing more they can do. And I did find it interesting, whether Agrippa had the authority to make such assessment over Festus, I think is arguable, as Agrippa is king of a neighboring region, not the ruler of the province of Judea. That was under Festus, but apparently he must have had influence, a great deal of influence over Festus for one reason or another.
Can I say something? Remember in the beginning of all this, he said, Festus said to him, listen, I have nothing to send to Caesar. Technically, is what he said. I have no charges to place against this man who sent him. Will you sit there and help me to come up, in a sense, with an answer of what he can be charged with, a reason to be sent? And this is where Agrippa turns back and says, you're right, he has no charges. There's nothing this man has done, but he appealed to Caesar, so he must go.
Yep. Yeah. No, and it's certainly interesting because they did not answer the question that they were looking for, which is what to write. So one does have to wonder what was sent along with him. However, I don't know that we ever really learned the answer to that question. All right. So I would like it if we could have a reader. Maybe Megan, would you like to read for us the chapter, the 27, these 8 verses?
And when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some of the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking on the ship of Adramatium, which was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. And the next day, we were put in at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea, across the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon. Coasting along it with great difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lacia.
All right, so a lot of sort of just travel narrative, but as you guys know, I love to take these moments and give us a little bit of historical context, and so that's what we will do here. So mostly we're going to be talking a little bit about sailing and a little bit about the various places that are referenced, and then some tie-ins back to some interesting historical tidbits here. So now that the decision has been made, arguments are over. Paul is now finally beginning his journey towards Rome. The word Luke uses here is ekrathy. And we've encountered this before, and it means to select or choose, pick out, but it also means to judge or pronounce judgment. So you can see why the word decided was used here, but the judgment has been made. We should sail for Italy. So Luke informs us that Paul was given over to a hekapton tarchi, and we've touched on this word before. This refers to a centurion, a commander of 100, and we are specifically told that he is his name is Julius, and that he is a very Roman name, right? But he's part of a cohort called the Sebastes. That's the Greek word here, and Sebastes means roughly it means Augustine. When we hit this word before, we talked about the fact that this was a word used to refer to the emperor. So one could say that this is the emperor's cohort. What does that mean? Why is the emperor's cohort in Syria, in Caesarea? So I did a little bit of research. Now, keep in mind, this is my interpretation of what I learned, because I could not find anybody who could agree on anything regarding this particular reference here. But what I believe this was is that this unit was part of what in Latin was called the cohorts urbanae. Now, the cohort urbanae originally was, it's basically the military police. And they reported directly to the governor, right? So these would have been soldiers that were in charge of managing all criminal matters in their precincts. And the cohort would have been presided over by a tribune of the court. And so therefore, Julius would have been one of 6 centurions, because this cohort was usually typically made up of 600 men. And so therefore, he would have served in that, in this urban cohort. Now, from what I was able to learn, the Augustan cohort came with a few advantages over traditional military service. So I didn't go back and look at the traditional military service, but I believe it was typically you committed to something like 5 or 10 years of service in the military, and the Rome would then send you, typically it was not in your home province. The difference between the two is that the Augustan cohort would have been stationed in a city. It was a term of 20 years, but you also got 50% greater pay than traditional service. And so it didn't involve a lot of travel, right? You weren't out campaigning, you were stationed in a city, you would have lived there, you would have had your family with you. Think of it like our soldiers today, we station them in cities where we maintain a presence, like in Germany, South Korea. So that would have been along those lines. Now, this particular cohort in the region of Syria would have been created likely during Nero's reign. So this is a relatively new thing from what I can see from a historical standpoint, because prior to Nero, there was only one urban cohort, and that was located in Rome. They were the police of Rome. When Nero came in, according to what I was able to find, he created an additional 6, though some, and this is where we get into conflict. Some people said it was only 3 that were total. Some said 7. There was lots of arguments over who created what when. The general consensus is Nero expanded the military police force, and he created new divisions that were then stationed in other key cities like Carthage, for example. Now, we know that there was a lot of unrest in this region, so it does make sense that in his goal to establish military police in key locations, this region likely got one. This is me theorizing because I had a really hard time finding consistent historical references. But since we believe and have to believe that what is recorded in the Bible is historically accurate, therefore we must take these words of Luke and assume that that's the placement. That's why he refers to him as being of the Augustan cohort. The emperor's cohort would have been what they referred to as the military police in the time. So me connecting dots, again, I'm not an expert historian on Roman history by any means, but that's where I get that. But either way, Julius was charged with monitoring them, and he likely had his entire, maybe not all of it, but odds are he took his 100 men with him to guard the prisoner. right? That's because we're told there were prisoners, plural. And we're told that they board a ship from Andrometino, or Andromitum. So let me get here. So where is Andromitum? So it's up here, roughly. So you may recall that Troas. Actually, I think I've got that circled in the wrong spot. Troas was that city, that port city that they traveled, and that's, I think, what I actually have circled here. This was Andromatia, was southeast of Troas, and this is basically the Bay of Andromatia. And so it's along that western coast of Asia. So you can imagine that this guy, he's probably was on his way home with goods, the captain of the ship. And so therefore it would have taken them roughly halfway is how I picture it. Now, obviously, when we look at the map, we realize it ended up being more like a third of the way. He could have probably taken them further before they changed ships, but I'm guessing Myra must have been a good port for that. At the very least, because they encountered this other merchant. We'll talk about him in a moment. And you get the impression that the Romans were very commonly commandeered vessels for their purposes. So being what it is. And so Luke refers to it as we. So he's including himself as his narrative. So it's possible that he was an attendant to Paul. But we have this reference to Aristarchus coming along with them. So I went back and I looked at Aristarchus, right? So he first appeared in chapter 19. We talked about him as a member of Paul's entourage, and when he was in Ephesus. And then he's named along with Gaius when the artisans of Ephesus rose up and rioted in the name of Artemis. You may or may not remember that story, when they sought to capture Paul and instead dragged Aristarchus and Gaius with the intent to either draw Paul out or to kill them. He's then named again in Macedonia when he initially resolved to return, when Paul first initially resolved to return to Jerusalem to fulfill his vow. Right, so that was when they celebrated the Passover, and he's like, I want to be in Jerusalem by Shavuot, right? So he had 50 weeks or 50 days to get to Jerusalem, and Aristarchus was part of that party. So based on that, we can believe that Aristarchus likely was in Jerusalem with Paul. And then we have one other interesting reference, and that is in one of the epistles. He is referred to by Paul as my fellow prisoner, Aristarchus. So here is my theory. I believe Paul was considered the ringleader, and it's quite possible that the prisoners that are being referred to are Paul, Aristarchus, Luke, etc., 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 etc. All the people who were traveling with him. Now, this is me theorizing again, but I think there's enough connection there to say that at the very, very minimum, Aristarchus was being held with Paul. Paul was being allowed to speak because he was the ringleader. But it's very likely, based on this, if they weren't arrested at the same time as him, these were other Christians that had been arrested and they were being held while they were deciding what to do about Paul specifically. And if Paul had been executed, all these men might have been executed along with him. All right, so he makes a note, Luke notes that they stop here roughly in Sidon. Sidon, we talked about Sidon in the past. When we talked about Tyre and Sidon, there was a dispute referenced at the time when Herod had his little incident with the worms. So we won't go into details about that, except to mention it's an ancient city. Now, Luke notes that Julius specifically shows kindness to Paul and allows him to visit associates in Sidon. And I had to read this a couple times because I thought it was rather interesting. So the phrase here is trisamanos epetrepsen pros philus poretenti. And so that first word, trisamanos, it's linked by Strong's to the word kreomai, and which according to Thayer refers to the act of borrowing. I thought that was an interesting word, borrowing or receiving a loan. So then you get And so that's that idea, right, of something that's taken and returned. Then you have, epetrasin, which refers to entrusting another, permitting, giving leave, those two words together. So you kind of get this sense of the permission to borrow or use, in the sense that Paul's been given leave. I thought that was interesting. And then it seems like one of those phrases, that doesn't translate literally. So maybe it's an idiom. Then you have pros being the familiar word, right? That sense of toward or to. Philos then refers to someone who's friendly. And lastly, porethunti, that's from the root word poreo, refers to a transfer or to depart. So similarly, you get this act of departing, traveling, crossing over. So when I put it all together, I get this sense of he's being permitted with expectation of return to depart to his friends. And I thought, how strange is that? He's a prisoner, right? How often do prisoners get, on their own cognition allowed to step out away from their temporary prison, away from their guards? Because we don't get the sense that he's given an escort, just that he's allowed to go. You have something to say, Dad?
Yes. What one thought that I faced on this is that he was allowed to go to his friends there because he needed to have money to cover his expenses, and that Julius, because he had no real orders of him being a bad person or anything else, basically he was told this man shouldn't even be going to Rome. But that's what he's asked. So therefore, Julius says, okay, on your own cognition, you demand to go to Rome, want to continue to go to Rome. Then you come back here after you get something to take care of your needs. And, and that's the way it went.
Yeah, and it's a perfectly reasonable thought. The thought that I had was, think about the fact that if Julius was, if I'm correct, he was military police, part of a unit stationed for 20 years in Caesarea. Over the course of 2 years, perhaps he was in charge of the prisoners in the palace. Therefore, he could very well have become friends with Paul over that period of time. And so, and maybe even he'd become a Christian due to Paul's witness, right? So while I think Paul would never have asked Julius to compromise himself, Julius would have trusted Paul to return on his own cognition. Just a slightly different take. Yeah, go ahead. No? Okay. So Luke records then about this statement about Cyprus, and he says, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, or the word here is hypepteusamen. It's a sailing term, and I wasn't familiar with it, so I had to look it up. So it refers to this sense of the leeward side. And what is the leeward side? It refers to the sheltered side, or the side in which the wind is not strong. Because when I first looked at it, I saw it's a sail under, and I thought, sail under? All the maps show them sailing north of Cyprus. And when I think sailing under, I think, going south. So then I found this lovely wind map. This is a modern wind map. Unfortunately, you might be finding that our pictures are slightly blocking the view of Cyprus. But if you can see here, the winds actually, the standard wind patterns actually blow eastward under Cyprus and westward above Cyprus. So you get this sense that, and then you get the sense here of, from Luke, and I completely forgot to highlight it, is he uses this word enantius, and that means against, opposite, contrary, hostile. And that's where we get the winds were against us. So basically it was like an opponent, an angry opponent. And I guess from a sailing standpoint, when the wind's not blowing in your favor, I guess you'd think of it that way. So you get this sense that when they tried to sail, they were hitting headwinds, so they had to go north of Cyprus. Not an important detail per se, but I think it's easy to gloss over when we're reading it. And I thought it was interesting too, because that word that Luke uses here sort of gets this feeling that the ship's captain is being thwarted in his plans almost from the beginning, right? So they go north of Cyprus, and you can see here, this is what and almost every map looks like this. This is approximately how they draw out this path that he takes, hugging the coastline. right? All along Cilicia, Pamphylia, and then they come to Myra. Myra of Lycia. So I thought it was a little interesting history on Myra. So the name is apparently from Sanskrit. When I first plugged the name in, what first thing that popped up is Myra being this ancient name that refers to beauty, sweet, admirable, extraordinary. So you get the impression from the name that maybe the founders might have been enamored with the region, the beauty of the region. And so here's some pictures of Myra. I couldn't get any really big, beautiful coastal views, which would have been awesome. But these are tombs that have been carved into the hills of Myra. And the earliest records, interestingly enough, even though the name Myra is very ancient, the earliest records actually are only back to 168 BC during the Lycian League, where Myra is first mentioned. And there wasn't a lot of information from it, like archaeological records or things like that. And then I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, so please bear with me. I found out was the home of Saint Nicholas of Myra, and that he was this Saint Nicholas he was a possible member of the Council of Nicaea. There's a lot of myths and legends around him. The one you might particularly be familiar with is Santa Claus. This was the original home of the Saint Nicholas, because, and they believe that the legend is that the reason that the mythos grew around him is he had apparently a habit of secretly giving gifts to people. Like he would just like leave gifts for them in hidden places and things like that. It's kind of, I think he got pleasure out of giving gifts, but didn't want people to know it was him. And then, eventually people caught on. So I thought that was interesting. And while I was tangenting, I stumbled on to this rabbit trail of various theologies because of his connection to that period of time, the Nicene Council, Constantine, all of that. And in the course of following my rabbit trails, I stumbled onto a tradition or a theology known as Sabellianism. And that is the belief that the Trinity, which is the belief that the Trinity is separate aspects of God. And I thought, I've never had a term to put to my perspective on the Trinity, because I believe that the Trinity, each piece of the Trinity is an aspect of God, that it's all God, it's just an aspect of him. And that's different than the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is this separate but equal. And so because of that, and I'm going to touch on this, I'm going to come back to this at the end. I want to get through this section first. Next time we get together, I'm not going to be touching on Acts. I'm actually going to go through and I'm going to break down the various theological positions of the early church, from Trinitarianism to Sabellianism to Arianism, et cetera, et cetera. There are probably more than a dozen different viewpoints, most of which have been squashed out by the church over the course of history, but we still have records of them. And so I thought, I'm curious, and I imagine everyone else might be curious with me, to learn a little bit about who are the people. I'm just gonna, I guess I'll go to that, and then we'll wrap up the last little bit that I had about the story here. But I want to look at, what is the origins, the viewpoints, proponents, and maybe even merits in scripture that go into these various perspectives on God. And it's all specifically about the relationship between God and Yeshua and the Holy Spirit, right? There was not a lot of agreement by the point the Council of Nicaea came along. And the Council of Nicaea, when they did their meeting, the majority decided on this particular perspective because that's what Constantine wanted them to do. And then they pronounced everybody else heretics, and a lot of them were killed. So that's why we don't have a lot of records of these other viewpoints. But I think it's worthwhile at least looking at it from a historical context. So anyway, I'm sorry, I really got down a rabbit trail there, but I just thought it was really interesting. So going back to our journey here. Yeah.
I was gonna say like father, like son.
I know. So we don't have much left of these verses, and we've got just enough time, I think, to get through them. So historical and geographical information, all that fun stuff. So he records that at Myra, they switched ships, right? Because the original boat would have been shortly after turning north, heading towards the home, the Andromaetia. So they needed a ship heading in the direction of Rome. And Luke specifically notes that the centurion finds this ship from Alexandria. And there's Alexandria down there in Egypt. And you can see here that to get to Myra is almost a direct straight line across the Mediterranean from Alexandria. So I'm guessing that Myra must have been one of those resupply points, rather than heading, straight towards Italy or maybe following the coastal route. This ship was probably more designed for sailing. And just a little bit of history here in the Roman era, Alexandria was the source of all the grain, well, not all the grain, a lot of the grain that fed all of the Roman world. At this point in time, this Nile region, you can see here the Nile region where Alexandria is located, that valley, that floodplain, is much like the Midwest is to the modern world today. Just it was a huge fertile area that grew so much food, and it produced such yields that when there was famine in Egypt, the rest of the world had famine, right? Because this is where once Rome captured that region, that's where they got all their food from. And even beforehand, they would buy the food from Egypt. And then, of course, Rome being Rome, they conquered it, and then they used it afterwards as their source of food for much of the Roman world. Because by that point in time, Rome was no longer relying on its own farmers, really. It just an interesting thing. Now, in our story here, we're told that they begin having issues sailing slowly, right? This word, Brady Pluntis. And we're going to look at that wind map again here for a second. And you can see here that normally the winds should have not been an issue. However, in this case, we must have had, so I didn't include this map, but there were certain named wind fronts that could come down against the normal currents. And that's, I'm guessing, what had happened here. And it could have been based on the time of year, because we know this was late. If it was 2 years from when Paul was captured and maybe a little after, this would have been late fall. But I didn't look. I was having trouble finding seasonal maps for the wind patterns, because I thought it would have given us more context. We're told that it was with difficulty, molis. And we see this word here pops up twice in the next two verses here. So it sounds like almost like a supernatural situation. And he notes that they make it to Nidus. So here's the winds my maps are out of order, but they make it to Nidus here. And at Nidus, they decide we can't keep going forward. So they end up going south. They give in to the winds. So you can see here, normally that's not the case, but it would have driven them south. And then we're told that they made it as far as Crete. Do I have a map of Crete here? Yeah. So there's Salmon. And then we're told that they, once again, because of the difficulty, they end up taking the leeward side of Crete. Now, here's what's interesting is when I go back to the maps here, I circled it here. Normally, the leeward side of Crete would have been the northern side of Crete, right? But based on what's described here, they reference this Salmon, which is it's a cape on the eastern coast of Crete. And then they refer to this location, this harbor, Fair Havens or Lasea. So the word kalous lamenis in Greek translates to beautiful harbor, or beautiful to look upon harbor, pleasing, excellent in its nature. So whatever this natural harbor is, it must have been very, very good. And in history and even modern days, we know that the harbor exists, and that's how we know where they were at, because they have found this particular harbor. However, the city with references of Lasea or Lasea doesn't exist. There is no Lasea. There never was a Lasea, near as we can tell. So which makes me think that Luke either misheard or something got maybe smeared in the ink, because the nearby city is actually called Hollis, or possibly Thalassa. So just an interesting little tidbit there. But that's where they ended up stopping. And so when we do get back to getting into Acts again and continuing the story, we'll see that there's an argument over whether or not to winter in this harbor. But recall, when we look at the wind maps, the winds would not necessarily have been kind to someone maybe harboring for the winter in this particular location. And I think that's where the captains comes in, because when we pick it up again, this is when they end up getting lost out at sea and shipwrecked on the island of Malta. But we'll get there. So that is where I'm at. And then, like I said, I think next time I'm going to take a brief dive into the history of the Trinity and the various early church perspectives on that. And that will be for next time, our study. So yes, Dad.
We are on the road again. Wanted to say we love you guys. Take care.
All right.
And that because to make our time, we're going to have to go.
Okay.
Pray for our
Sounds
safety
good.
as we travel.
Yep.
Okay.
Close out. So you real quick in
Okay.
prayer.
You guys can go ahead and leave while I'm praying if you need to. Oh Adonai, I just pray that you give all of us safety, especially Veri and Bethany traveling on the road. And we thank you for this time that we could spend together, looking into your word and trying to understand the various things going on. And we just thank you that we can do this. And we thank you for this time. In the name of Yeshua, amen.
Amen.